I never thought I'd find myself standing in front of a crowd talking about the one question I asked the feds. But here we are, and it all starts with a moment that, at the time, felt pretty ordinary. Life throws you into situations, and sometimes the right question is staring you in the face. You just have to have the guts to ask it. For me, it wasn't about making a headline or proving something to anyone. It was about clarity. It was about knowing the truth in a world where the truth isn't always easy to find, especially when it comes from the people who are supposed to know. The situation I was dealing with, it wasn't small. It was one of those things that gnaws at you, that keeps you up at night, that makes you start questioning not just the people around you, but the whole system itself. And I realized that if nobody else was going to put it out there, if nobody else was going to say it straight, then I had to. I had to be the one asking, because silence in the face of questions, especially important ones, it doesn't mean nothing. It means something, and usually it means trouble. So I thought about it. I thought about what had been happening, what everyone was ignoring, what they were all too busy to see or too scared to admit, and I boiled it down. I figured if I could ask the right question, just one, maybe it would cut through all the noise. Maybe it would force a little honesty into the room, because, let's be real, the truth is a funny thing. People talk about it like it's black and white, but when the people in power start avoiding it, it turns gray fast, and then you're left piecing things together, trying to make sense of half-truths and empty words. I won't lie. I felt a mix of things that day. Nervous, curious, frustrated, but mostly determined. Determined because I knew that question wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who had ever felt left in the dark. Everyone who had ever been told trust us and had no reason to. And I figured, what's the worst that could happen? They could refuse to answer? Yeah, that's a possibility. But even that possibility has a story to tell, and sometimes the story is just as important as the answer itself. So I wrote it down, clear and simple. Not a trick question, not some clever wordplay, just straight to the point. And I sent it off. And I waited. And that's when I realized something else. Sometimes asking the right question is a gamble. You don't know how it's going to land. But if you don't ask, you'll never know. If you don't push, the walls just stay up, and the silence becomes the answer you didn't want but had to face. And that's why I asked. Because if nobody else was going to demand it, I had to. And sometimes that's all it takes to start shaking the system. This closes with a strong, impactful line. And sometimes that's all it takes to start shaking the system. If you want, I can also expand key point 2 in the same Tony-style voice, keeping the suspense and intensity as he reveals the question he asked. Do you want me to do that next? So now, you might be wondering, what was the question? What was that one thing I decided was worth putting everything on the line for, worth asking the feds themselves? Let me tell you, this wasn't some clever trick or a line designed to get a reaction. It was simple, plain. And that's exactly why it mattered. Because sometimes the simplest questions are the ones that cut the deepest, the ones people don't want to answer, because they're afraid of what the answer might mean. I didn't need to ask 50 questions. I didn't need to beat around the bush. I didn't need to pretend I was some genius trying to outsmart the system. No, I knew that if I wanted the truth, or at least something close to it, I had to be direct. I had to strip it down to the core. And when I finally put pen to paper, I realized how much power a single well-placed question can hold. It's like holding a key to a door that nobody wants open, and I wanted that door opened. The question itself was sharp, and it carried weight. Not just for me, but for anyone who's ever been caught in a situation where answers are hidden, where rules are bent, where explanations are promised but never delivered. It was the kind of question that doesn't let people off the hook. The kind that lingers, that forces a pause, that makes them consider whether they can actually justify their silence. And that's what I was going for. Not confrontation for the sake of it, but accountability. Plain and simple. I remember the moment I asked it. I felt the tension of the situation, the kind of tension that makes your pulse quicken, even when you're just writing a few words. Because you know that once it's out there, once that question is asked, there's no taking it back. You're forcing them to face something, to either answer or stay quiet. And let me tell you, silence is not nothing. It speaks louder than any words they could give you. What struck me most was how clean and uncomplicated the question was. No gimmicks, no jargon, no trying to sound smarter than anyone else. Just the raw, unvarnished question that cut to the heart of what needed to be known. And in that simplicity, there was power. Because sometimes the people who think they control the answers, they underestimate how threatening simplicity can be. It strips away the distractions, the excuses, the smoke and mirrors, and leaves you with just the truth, or the refusal to give it. And when I finally sent it off, I felt this mix of anticipation and certainty. Anticipation because, yeah, I didn't know how they would respond, but certainty because I knew I had asked the right thing, the one thing that mattered. One question, one shot at forcing clarity in a situation where clarity was scarce. That was all I needed. And in the end, that question wasn't just a line of text. It was a challenge, a test, and a mirror, all rolled into one strong closing line for impact. One question, one shot at forcing clarity in a situation where clarity was scarce. I can move on to key point 3 next, keeping this same suspenseful Tony-style storytelling, as he reveals the Fed's refusal to answer. Should I do that? Now here's where things get interesting, and maybe a little frustrating. Because I thought, once you ask the right question, once it's out there and it's clear, the answer should follow, right? You'd think. But that's not how it works with people who hold power, especially not the feds. They've got layers, walls, excuses, a whole system built to keep things tucked away neatly, far from the eyes of anyone asking tough questions. And that's exactly what I ran into. When I got their response, or I should say the lack of it, I realized something. They didn't want to answer. Not directly, not honestly, not in any way that gave me what I needed. It wasn't a "we're working on it" or a "we'll get back to you" kind of situation. It was the silence that hit me first, the official dodge, the careful phrasing that didn't say anything at all. You know the kind, full of words but empty at the core, and it's maddening because you know it's deliberate. They weren't confused, they weren't slow, they were choosing not to tell me what I wanted to know. At first, I tried to make sense of it. Maybe they needed time. Maybe their air regulations or bureaucracy in the way. Maybe I had phrased the question wrong. But no, I reviewed everything. I double-checked the language, the context, even the way I sent it, and it hit me. They didn't want to answer. Period. That's when the frustration turns into understanding. But the understanding isn't comforting. It's cold. Because it tells you exactly how the system works. Sometimes the truth isn't hidden because it's unknown. It's hidden because it's inconvenient. And I'll be honest, that feeling of being stonewalled, it's a mix. There's disbelief, yeah, there's anger, definitely. But there's also this strange respect in a twisted way for the game being played. They're professionals at what they do. They know how to avoid giving you what you want without technically saying no. It's a skill, but it's also a wall. And when that wall stands in front of a question that should be simple to answer, you start to realize just how much power silence holds. Here's the thing. Their refusal to answer didn't just leave me hanging. It said something louder than any yes or no ever could. It said, we control the story, we control the information, and we decide when, if ever, it reaches you. That's the reality when you deal with authorities who operate with that much caution, that much control. And it's a lesson. One you don't always get to learn without bumping your head against it first, so I sat there reading the response, or rather reading the careful avoidance, and it hit me. Asking the question was only half the battle. The other half? Seeing how far they would go to dodge it. That's when you see the game for what it really is, and you realize you've got to be smarter, tougher, and more patient if you want to break through the silence. And in that moment, I understood the weight of a refusal. Not just as a person asking a question, but as someone who had learned to read between the lines, to see the spaces where truth hides, and to know that silence can be louder than any answer. Closing line for impact, silence can be louder than any answer. I can now expand key point 4 in the same style, exploring the implications of their silence and keeping that tense, Tony-style storytelling. Should I go ahead with that? When they refused to answer, it wasn't just an empty gesture. It carried weight, consequences, and a message that went beyond me. You see, silence from people in power isn't neutral. It's deliberate. It shapes the way things move, the way people think, the way situations unfold, and that's something most folks don't fully realize until they feel it firsthand. It's like a heavy curtain dropping over a room. You can see shapes moving behind it, hear the noise, but the real picture, the details, the truth stays hidden, and that's exactly what their silence did. The implications hit me in layers. On one hand, it was frustrating, because I knew the answer mattered. It mattered to me, sure, but more importantly, it mattered to everyone watching, everyone invested, everyone who needed transparency to make sense of what was going on. When a question goes unanswered, it doesn't just leave a gap, it creates uncertainty. And uncertainty, it breeds doubt, suspicion, and mistrust. That's the real impact. People start questioning everything. Not just the subject at hand, but the whole system. And when the people supposed to provide answers step back and hide, they hand that doubt over to you without even trying. On another level, their refusal showed me the limits of authority when it comes to accountability. Power is a tricky thing. You think it's about rules, regulations, or oversight, but a lot of the time it's about control over what people know, control over the narrative, control over how much they can see behind the curtain. And when that control is exercised through silence, it's a reminder that accountability isn't automatic. You have to demand it. You have to press for it. And sometimes you have to accept that the system wasn't designed to make it easy for you. But here's the thing. While silence can frustrate, it also teaches you something important. It forces you to pay attention to the gaps, to read between the lines, to understand that what isn't said can sometimes be more revealing than what is. Their refusal was a statement all on its own. It told me where the boundaries were, how far the reach of the system extended, and how careful or guarded the people in it were. It gave me insight into the machinery of authority, even without an actual answer. And on a broader scale, it reminded me why asking tough questions matters. Because if you don't, who will? If everyone accepts the silence, the uncertainty, the half-truths, then nothing changes. The system stays the same and the curtain stays drawn. Their refusal wasn't just a wall, it was a spotlight on why persistence, courage, and clarity are essential. That's the lesson you take away. Silence can be imposed, but it doesn't have to be accepted. You can push pride, shine a light into the dark corners, even if it's uncomfortable. When I realized the feds weren't going to answer, I had a choice. I could sit back, shrug it off, pretend it didn't matter, and move on. That would have been easy, comfortable even, but that's not how I operate. You see, being faced with silence, it does something to a person. It either shuts you down or lights a fire under you. And for me, it lit a fire, because once you've asked the right question and been met with a wall, you start thinking differently. You start planning differently. You start seeing what needs to be done in order to get some measure of clarity. At first, I admit there was frustration. Not just the kind that makes you clench your fists, but the kind that keeps you up at night, turning over every scenario, every possible outcome. I thought about what their refusal meant. I thought about the consequences of their silence. And I had to admit to myself, this wasn't just a personal matter anymore. Their silence affected more than just me. It affected everyone who relied on transparency, on accountability, on truth. That's when the frustration shifted into resolve. I started looking at my options. I asked myself, what's the point of a question if you don't follow through, if you don't push, if you don't shine a light on the corners that people want to keep dark? Then you've basically let the silence win. And I wasn't about to let that happen. I reached out again. I followed up. I made sure my inquiry was clear and unambiguous. I documented everything, every exchange, every delay, every non-answer, because sometimes the power of persistence isn't just in getting an answer. It's in showing the pattern. It's in making the silence undeniable. And while I was doing that, I realized something else. Asking the question and pushing for an answer doesn't just affect them. It affects you. It changes the way you think about responsibility, about courage, about being willing to stand up even when it's uncomfortable, even when it seems like the odds are against you. I felt that shift. I felt the weight of responsibility, but I also felt the energy of taking action, because there's a difference between complaining about silence and confronting it. There's a difference between feeling powerless and actually doing something to regain control. I also made sure that my experience didn't stay in a vacuum. I shared it carefully with those who needed to hear it, those who might learn from it, or those who could help amplify the pressure. Because sometimes action isn't just about the direct line to the source. Sometimes it's about building momentum, letting other people see what's happening, letting them feel the tension and urgency of unanswered questions. That's how you turn a refusal into an opportunity to highlight the gaps, to challenge the system, to make it clear that silence is not acceptable. In the end, what I learned in that process is that next steps aren't always glamorous. They aren't always straightforward, but they're necessary. They're what separates someone who waits for answers from someone who creates accountability. And sometimes the act of pushing, of standing firm, of refusing to let silence win is the most powerful answer of all. Closing line for impact, refusing to let silence win is sometimes the most powerful answer of all. I can now expand key point 6, giving the broader lesson and a strong, inspirational conclusion for the speech in Tony's voice. Should I do that next? So I walked away from that refusal, not defeated, but aware of the stakes, aware of the dynamics, and aware that silence carries its own voice. And that voice, loud as it is, challenges you to act. Closing line for impact. Silence carries its own voice, and it challenges you to act. I can continue with key point 5, focusing on Tony's personal reaction and next steps, keeping the same narrative tension and reflective tone. Should I move on to that? By the time I stepped back and looked at the whole situation, it hit me that this wasn't just about one question, one refusal, or even one person trying to get an answer. It was bigger than that. It was about the principle behind asking questions, about the responsibility each of us carries when we see something that doesn't sit right, when we sense the cracks in the system. Because here's the truth, systems, even the ones built to protect, aren't perfect. They make mistakes, they hide things, they delay, they avoid, and if nobody stands up, if nobody pushes, then nothing changes. That's the real lesson. And let me tell you, standing up doesn't always look heroic. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's uncomfortable, sometimes it feels like you're banging your head against the wall. But that's where the work begins. That's where accountability starts to take shape. The moment you decide to ask the hard questions, to follow through, to shine a light into corners people want to keep dark, that's when the story starts to change. And it doesn't matter whether you're dealing with a big system or just a small circle of influence. The principle is the same. Courage, persistence, and clarity, they matter everywhere. I realize, too, that asking tough questions isn't just about challenging others. It's about challenging yourself. You have to be willing to confront uncertainty, to face the possibility that the answer may be uncomfortable, inconvenient, or even unwelcome. You have to be ready for frustration, for delays, for silence. But you also have to know that the act of asking itself has power. The very act of demanding clarity sends a signal that someone is paying attention, that someone cares, that someone refuses to accept excuses. That alone shifts the balance. And that's why I think this story resonates. It's not just a story about me or about the feds. It's about every person who has ever felt ignored, brushed aside, or silenced. It's about everyone who's ever wondered whether speaking up matters. The answer is yes, it does. Every time you ask the question, every time you refuse to be silenced, every time you push for honesty and transparency, you chip away at the walls that try to contain the truth. And in that, there's a lesson for everyone. Courage doesn't have to roar. Sometimes it's the quiet persistence that leaves the deepest mark. Looking back, I see now that this journey taught me more than the answer could have. Because sometimes the lesson isn't in the words you get back. Sometimes the lesson is in the process, in recognizing where power and authority operate, in seeing the way systems protect themselves, and in discovering your own strength to insist on clarity even when it seems impossible. That's the bigger picture. That's the takeaway I want to leave with you tonight. Because in the end, asking the right question, standing firm in the face of refusal, and refusing to accept silence, it's not just an act, it's a responsibility, a test, and a chance to make a difference, no matter how big or small. And that responsibility belongs to all of us. Closing line for impact, refusing to accept silence is not just an act, it's a responsibility we all carry. If you want, I can now help combine all 6 key points into a full, polished speech in Tony's voice, flowing seamlessly from start to finish with natural transitions. You want me to do that?